Case 1. Amy Hebert, 2007. The Lake Charles Double Tragedy. The year 2007 brought unspeakable horror to Lake Charles, Louisiana, when Amy Hebert made a decision that would forever mark her as one of the state's most notorious maternal criminals. This case shocked the Calcasieu Parish community and raised disturbing questions about mental health, family dynamics, and the ultimate betrayal of maternal duty. Amy Hebert was not the stereotypical monster that people imagine when they think of child killers. She was a mother living in Lake Charles, a city known for its chemical plants, casinos, and proximity to the Texas border. To neighbors and acquaintances, she appeared to be an ordinary woman dealing with the challenges of parenthood. But behind closed doors, something was terribly wrong. The details that emerged from the Lake Charles Police Department investigation painted a picture of a woman in crisis, but that crisis would claim 2 innocent lives, her own children. The methods and circumstances of these deaths revealed a level of premeditation and cold calculation that contradicted any explanation of momentary madness or accidental tragedy. In Lake Charles, a city of roughly 70,000 residents in southwestern Louisiana, the community is tight-knit. When tragedy strikes, everyone feels it. The Hebert case sent shockwaves through neighborhoods where children played in yards and families gathered at local churches. Parents held their children closer, unable to comprehend how a mother could deliberately take the lives of her own offspring. The investigation into Amy Hebert revealed a complex picture. Court documents and police reports indicated that she was the primary caregiver for her 2 children, both under the age of 10. The children attended local schools in the Calcasieu Parish School District, where teachers later reported no obvious signs of abuse or neglect in the months leading up to the tragedy. This made the crime even more incomprehensible to those who knew the family. What makes the Hebert case particularly disturbing is the deliberate nature of the acts. This was not a case of a mother snapping in a moment of frustration or losing control during discipline. The evidence presented by prosecutors showed that Amy Hebert made conscious choices that led to the deaths of both children. The timeline reconstructed by investigators showed a progression of events that could have been stopped at multiple points, but wasn't. The Lake Charles Police Department worked with the Calcasieu Parish District Attorney's Office to build a case that would ensure justice for the 2 young victims. Detective work included interviews with family members, neighbors, teachers, and anyone who had contact with the Hebert family in the months and weeks before the tragedy. What emerged was a picture of a woman who may have been struggling with issues that she kept hidden from the outside world. Mental health experts who later reviewed the case noted that maternal filicide, when a mother kills her own child, often involves complex psychological factors. Some cases involve severe postpartum depression or psychosis. Others involve intentional revenge against a partner, and still others occur in the context of attempting a murder-suicide where the mother survives. In Amy Hebert's case, the motivations became a central question during the legal proceedings. The community response to the Hebert case was one of horror and grief. Vigils were held for the 2 young victims, with candles lit and prayers offered at local churches throughout Lake Charles. The children's schools held memorial services, and grief counselors were brought in to help classmates and teachers process the unthinkable loss. In a city where family values are held in high regard, the Hebert case represented a fundamental violation of everything the community held sacred. The legal proceedings that followed the deaths moved through the Louisiana court system with the weight of intense public scrutiny. The Calcasieu Parish District Attorney's Office pursued charges that reflected the severity of the crimes. In Louisiana, the murder of children by a parent is treated with particular gravity, as it represents not just a homicide, but a profound betrayal of the fundamental duty of care that parents owe their offspring. Amy Hebert's defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. In cases of maternal filicide, defense strategies often center on mental illness, claiming that the defendant was not in control of her actions due to severe psychiatric disturbance. However, the evidence in the Hebert case made such arguments difficult to sustain. The prosecution presented evidence showing calculated actions rather than the chaotic behavior typically associated with acute psychotic episodes. The trial, when it occurred, brought the full horror of the case into public view. Testimony from medical examiners detailed the cause of death for both children, information that was difficult for even seasoned court observers to hear. The prosecution methodically built its case, showing that Amy Hebert had the opportunity, means, and apparent motive to commit these heinous acts. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the Calcasieu Parish courtroom where the case was heard, family members of the victims sat in the gallery, seeking justice for children who could no longer speak for themselves. The emotional impact of the trial was profound, with testimony bringing tears even to hardened law enforcement officers who had worked the case. The jury heard evidence that left no doubt about what had occurred in that Lake Charles home. The forensic evidence in the case was particularly damning. Crime scene investigators from the Lake Charles Police Department and the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab processed the scene with meticulous care, documenting every detail that could help explain what happened. The physical evidence corroborated the prosecution's theory of the case and contradicted alternative explanations offered by the defense. Neighbors who lived near the Hebert home told investigators that they had not heard anything unusual on the day of the crimes. No screaming, no commotion, nothing that would have alerted them to call for help. This silence made the crimes even more chilling. In a residential neighborhood where houses sit close together, the fact that such horror could occur without anyone knowing suggested a level of control and deliberation that contradicted claims of mental breakdown. The two children who died at their mother's hands were, by all accounts, typical Louisiana kids. They attended school, played with friends, and participated in activities common to children their age. Their lives were cut short before they had a chance to experience the milestones that should have been their birthright: graduations, first loves, careers, families of their own. Amy Hebert stole not just their present, but their entire future. In the aftermath of the case, Lake Charles residents grappled with difficult questions. How could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were missed? Could intervention at an earlier stage have saved these children? Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the need for better screening and support for mothers struggling with depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. But even these advocates acknowledged that the Hebert case seemed to fall outside the typical patterns of maternal mental health crises. The sentencing phase of the case brought its own emotional weight. In Louisiana, the murder of children can result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or even the death penalty in the most extreme cases. The judge who presided over the Hebert case had the difficult task of determining a sentence that reflected both the severity of the crimes and any mitigating factors that might warrant consideration. The victim impact statements read during sentencing brought the human cost of the crimes into stark relief. Family members who testified during sentencing described the two children in detail, their personalities, their dreams, their quirks and habits that made them unique individuals. These were not just statistics or case numbers. They were beloved children whose absence left a void that could never be filled. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and other relatives spoke through tears about the loss that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Amy Hebert's ultimate fate was sealed by the Louisiana justice system. The sentence she received reflected the state's commitment to protecting children and holding those who harm them accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Whether she expressed remorse for her actions became a matter of public record, and her words, or lack thereof, were scrutinized by those seeking to understand how a mother could commit such acts. Today, more than 15 years after the Lake Charles tragedy, the case remains one of Louisiana's most disturbing examples of maternal violence. The two children Amy Hebert killed are remembered not just as victims, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose potential was real, and whose loss diminished the entire community. In Lake Charles, their memory serves as a reminder of the sacred duty of parents to protect their children and the devastating consequences when that duty is not just neglected but deliberately violated. The broader implications of the Hebert case extend beyond Lake Charles. Child protection services in Louisiana and across the nation continually struggle with the challenge of identifying children at risk while respecting family privacy and parental rights. Cases like Amy Hebert's demonstrate that sometimes the danger comes from the person children should be able to trust most completely. This creates an almost impossible challenge for social workers, teachers, and others who work with families. Research into maternal filicide has identified several risk factors, including severe mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, and extreme stress. However, The research also shows that many mothers who kill their children do not fit neatly into predictable categories. Some show no obvious warning signs, making prevention extremely difficult. The Hebert case contributed to the body of knowledge about these crimes, even as it left more questions than answers. In the years since 2007, Lake Charles has continued to remember the two young victims of Amy Hebert's crimes. Memorial scholarships have been established in their names, ensuring that their memory continues to contribute something positive to the community that mourned their loss. Local organizations working to prevent child abuse and support struggling families have used the case as a tragic example of what can happen when intervention doesn't occur in time, or when evil simply cannot be predicted or prevented. The Hebert case also raised questions about the role of family and friends in identifying and reporting concerns about child welfare. In hindsight, were there signs that should have prompted someone to call Child Protective Services or law enforcement? Could extended family members have intervened more forcefully if they had concerns? These questions haunt not just this case, but every case of child abuse and neglect that ends in tragedy. For law enforcement officers who work the Hebert case, the investigation remains one of the most difficult of their careers. Police officers, detectives, and crime scene investigators train extensively to handle all types of cases, but crimes against children, especially by parents, take a particular emotional toll. The professionals who brought Amy Hebert to justice did their jobs with skill and dedication, but the cost of working such cases can be measured in nightmares, stress, and the weight of memories that never fade. The prosecution team that handled the case similarly found it professionally rewarding to secure justice for the victims, but personally draining to immerse themselves in the details of such horrific crimes. District attorneys and their staff must strike a balance between maintaining the emotional distance needed to function professionally and remaining connected enough to the human cost of crimes to advocate effectively for victims. In the Hebert case, that balance was tested to its limits. As we move forward in examining other cases of maternal violence in Louisiana, the Amy Hebert case serves as a sobering introduction to a topic that challenges our fundamental assumptions about motherhood, family, and safety. The year 2007 brought unthinkable tragedy to Lake Charles, and while justice was ultimately served, nothing can bring back the two innocent children whose lives were stolen by the person who should have protected them above all others. The legacy of this case extends beyond courtrooms and case files. It lives in the hearts of a community that will never forget, in the professional practices of those who work to protect children, and in the ongoing conversation about how society can better identify and prevent these unthinkable crimes. Most importantly, it lives in the memory of two children who deserved so much more than the brief lives they were given. Case 2. Twyena Thomas, 2017. The Baton Rouge Betrayal. A decade after the Lake Charles tragedy, Louisiana would once again be shocked by a case of maternal violence that defied comprehension. In 2017, Baton Rouge became the setting for another heartbreaking story of a mother betraying the most fundamental duty of parenthood. Twyena Thomas would become known for the death of her 2-year-old son, a crime that devastated East Baton Rouge Parish and raised new questions about the factors that lead to such unthinkable acts. Baton Rouge, Louisiana's capital city, sits along the Mississippi River in the southeastern part of the state. With a population of over 200,000, it's a city of diverse neighborhoods, from the historic districts near downtown to suburban developments on the outskirts. It's a city of universities, refineries, and a strong sense of Louisiana culture. But in 2017, one neighborhood in Baton Rouge would become the scene of a tragedy that would haunt the entire city. Twyena Thomas was not a name known to most Baton Rouge residents before 2017. She was one of hundreds of thousands of people living their lives in relative anonymity, raising a child, and dealing with whatever challenges her circumstances presented. But the choices she made in 2017 would ensure that her name would be forever associated with one of the city's most disturbing crimes. The victim in this case was a 2-year-old boy, a toddler who should have been experiencing the wonder of early childhood, learning to speak in full sentences, discovering the world around him, developing the personality that would carry him through life. Instead, his life was cut short by his own mother, in circumstances that investigators would spend months piecing together. The Baton Rouge Police Department received the call that would begin the investigation into Twyena Thomas on a day that started like any other in the capital city. Emergency responders arrived at a residence in East Baton Rouge Parish to find a scene that immediately raised red flags. The 2-year-old child was deceased, and the circumstances surrounding the death did not match the explanations being offered. In cases involving the death of young children, investigators follow strict protocols. The scene is treated as a potential crime scene until evidence proves otherwise. Medical examiners conduct thorough autopsies to determine the exact cause of death. Detectives interview everyone who had contact with the child in the hours and days before death. The process is methodical, detailed, and driven by the need to determine whether a death was accidental, the result of natural causes, or the result of criminal actions. The East Baton Rouge Parish Coroner's Office played a crucial role in the Thomas investigation. Forensic pathologists conducted a complete autopsy of the 2-year-old victim, documenting every injury, every abnormality, every detail that could help explain what happened. The findings from this autopsy would become central to the case against Twyena Thomas, providing objective medical evidence that contradicted claims of accidental death or natural causes. What the autopsy revealed was consistent with inflicted trauma. The pattern and severity of injuries indicated that this child had suffered violence at the hands of another person. The medical examiner's report, which would later be presented in court, detailed injuries that could not be explained by childhood accidents or natural disease processes. The 2-year-old had been deliberately harmed, and the harm had been fatal. As Baton Rouge police detectives dug deeper into the case, they reconstructed the timeline of events leading to the child's death. They interviewed Twyena Thomas extensively, and as often happens in such cases, inconsistencies began to appear in her account of events. Details changed from one telling to the next. Explanations for the child's injuries didn't align with the medical evidence. The investigation began to focus more narrowly on Thomas as the primary suspect in her son's death. The neighborhood where the Thomas family lived was typical of many working-class areas in Baton Rouge. Modest homes, families trying to make ends meet, children playing in yards and streets. Neighbors told police they had seen Twyena Thomas and her son around the neighborhood, but had not witnessed anything that raised immediate concerns about abuse or neglect. This is common in cases of child abuse. The violence often occurs behind closed doors, hidden from the eyes of potential witnesses or reporters. Child Protective Services records became part of the investigation. Detectives reviewed whether there had been any prior reports of concerns about the child's welfare, whether caseworkers had ever been involved with the family, and whether there were any documented interventions or services provided. The history of any CPS involvement can be crucial in understanding the context of a child's death and determining whether opportunities to prevent tragedy were missed. The East Baton Rouge Parish District Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence as it accumulated. In Louisiana, as in all states, prosecutors must determine whether there is sufficient evidence to bring criminal charges and what those charges should be. In cases involving the death of children, the charges can range from negligent homicide to first-degree murder, depending on the evidence of intent, premeditation, and the specific circumstances of the death. For Twyena Thomas, the charges that were ultimately filed reflected the prosecution's theory that this was not an accident, not negligence, but a deliberate act of violence against a defenseless 2-year-old child. The formal accusation marked the beginning of a legal process that would culminate in a trial where the full facts of the case would be presented to a jury of East Baton Rouge Parish residents. The 2-year-old boy at the center of this case had a name, a personality, a family beyond his mother who loved him. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, and other relatives mourned his loss and sought justice for his death. In victim impact statements and interviews with police, they described a happy toddler who was reaching developmental milestones and brought joy to those around him. The contrast between their memories of the child and the circumstances of his death made the tragedy even more difficult to bear. Community reaction to the case was one of anger and grief. Baton Rouge residents took to social media and community meetings to express their outrage that a mother could harm her own child. Vigils were held, with community members gathering to light candles and pray for the young victim. Local organizations working to prevent child abuse used the case to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse and the importance of reporting suspicions to authorities. The investigation also examined whether Twyena Thomas had been experiencing any specific stressors or challenges that might have contributed to the crime. Financial problems, relationship issues, substance abuse, mental health struggles. All of these factors can increase the risk of child maltreatment. However, while such factors may help explain why abuse occurs, they never excuse it. Many people face tremendous stress without harming their children, and the presence of challenges in Thomas's life did not absolve her of responsibility for her actions. The criminal justice process moved forward with the deliberate pace typical of serious felony cases. Pretrial hearings addressed legal questions about evidence admissibility, potential defenses, and procedural matters. The defense team representing Twyena Thomas faced the difficult task of defending a client accused of killing her own 2-year-old child, a crime that generates visceral reactions from potential jurors and the public at large. When the case went to trial, the courtroom in East Baton Rouge Parish became the setting for a careful presentation of evidence by both prosecution and defense. Prosecutors called medical experts to explain the autopsy findings and demonstrate why the injuries were inconsistent with accidental causes. Police investigators testified about the investigation and the statements made by Twyena Thomas. The physical evidence from the scene was presented, and the timeline of events was laid out in meticulous detail. The defense strategy in such cases often focuses on creating reasonable doubt about whether the defendant was actually responsible for the death. Could someone else have harmed the child? Could the injuries have been caused by an accident that looked like intentional harm? Was there sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Twyena Thomas deliberately caused her son's death? These questions formed the core of the defense approach. However, the prosecution's case was strong. The medical evidence was clear and compelling. The investigation had been thorough and professional. The timeline established that Twyena Thomas was the only person with opportunity to inflict the fatal injuries. The jury heard testimony that painted a picture of what had happened to the 2-year-old boy in the final hours of his life, and that picture pointed unmistakably to his mother as the perpetrator. Jury deliberations in cases involving child victims can be emotionally challenging for jurors, who must review evidence and photographs that are deeply disturbing. They must set aside natural emotional reactions and focus on whether the prosecution has met its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In the Thomas case, the jury took its responsibility seriously, deliberating carefully before reaching a verdict. The guilty verdict, when it came, brought a measure of justice for the 2-year-old victim, but could not bring him back or undo the suffering he endured. Twyena Thomas was convicted of causing the death of her own son, and the conviction triggered the sentencing phase of the proceedings. In Louisiana, sentences for the murder of children are severe, reflecting society's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. During sentencing, the court heard from family members who spoke about the impact of the child's death on their lives. Grandparents who had looked forward to watching their grandson grow up spoke of the void his absence left. Siblings who would never play with their brother again struggled to understand why their mother had done this terrible thing. The victim impact statements were heartbreaking, providing the court with a full picture of the ripple effects of this crime. The judge who sentenced Twyena Thomas had to balance multiple considerations: the severity of the crime, the need to protect society, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the requirements of justice for the victim. The sentence that was imposed reflected the gravity of taking the life of a 2-year-old child and ensured that Thomas would face significant consequences for her actions. In the years since 2017, the Baton Rouge community has continued to remember the 2-year-old boy who died at his mother's hands. Child advocacy organizations in East Baton Rouge Parish have used the case as part of their educational efforts, training mandated reporters, teachers, doctors, social workers, and others on how to recognize signs of abuse and when to make reports to Child Protective Services or law enforcement. The Thomas case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the resources available to struggling parents in Louisiana. While nothing excuses the murder of a child, advocates note that better access to mental health services, parenting education, substance abuse treatment, and economic support might prevent some cases of child maltreatment before they escalate to tragedy. The question is how to identify families in need and connect them with services before a crisis occurs. For the Baton Rouge Police Department detectives who worked the Thomas case, it remains a reminder of why their work matters. Investigating crimes against children is never easy, but knowing that their efforts led to justice for a 2-year-old victim provides some measure of professional satisfaction, even as the emotional weight of such cases stays with investigators for years. The prosecutor who tried the case similarly found it both rewarding and draining. Securing a conviction meant that a dangerous person was held accountable and that the victim's family received some degree of justice. But the process of presenting evidence about the death of a toddler, of cross-examining witnesses about horrific details, of seeing crime scene photographs and autopsy reports, all of this takes a toll on legal professionals who handle such cases. Twyena Thomas's life will be forever defined by what she did in 2017. Whatever else she may have accomplished, whatever potential she may have had, it was all overshadowed by the decision to kill her own 2-year-old son. She joins the tragic roster of Louisiana mothers who violated the most fundamental expectation of parenthood, that mothers protect their children, not harm them. The 2-year-old boy who died in Baton Rouge in 2017 is not forgotten. His short life mattered. His death was not meaningless. It prompted community action, policy discussions, and renewed commitment to protecting Louisiana's children. Those who knew him keep his memory alive, and the justice system ensured that his death was not ignored or dismissed, but prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. As we continue examining cases of maternal violence in Louisiana, the story of Twyena Thomas and her 2-year-old son stands as another sobering example of how the people who should be children's greatest protectors can instead become their greatest threat. It's a pattern that repeats across these cases, challenging our assumptions about maternal instinct and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence within families. Case 3. Felicia Marie Nicole Smith, 2018. The Girlfriend's Betrayal, the Death of Baby Levi Ellerby. The year 2018 brought another horrific case of child death to Louisiana, this time involving a woman who was not the biological mother, but was acting in a parental role. Felicia Marie Nicole Smith was the girlfriend of Levi Ellerby's mother, and she was entrusted with caring for the 6-month-old infant. What she did to that innocent baby shocked even hardened law enforcement officers and prosecutors who had seen numerous cases of child abuse. This case is distinct from others in our examination because Felicia Marie Nicole Smith was not Levi's biological mother. However, she was in a position of trust and authority over the child, functioning in a parental capacity as the mother's girlfriend. The betrayal of that trust makes her actions no less evil than those of biological mothers who harm their children. In the eyes of the law and in the experience of the victim, the relationship to the perpetrator matters far less than the fact that a trusted caregiver deliberately harmed a helpless infant. Baby Levi Ellerby was only 6 months old when his life was ended in the most horrific way imaginable. At 6 months, infants are at a precious stage of development, beginning to sit up on their own, responding to their names, laughing at peekaboo games, exploring the world with their hands and mouths. Levi should have been experiencing all of these developmental milestones under the protective care of adults who loved him. Instead, he experienced unimaginable suffering at the hands of Felicia Marie Nicole Smith. The method of Levi's death is particularly disturbing and requires a content warning. Felicia Marie Nicole Smith burned the 6-month-old baby. The details of how this occurred, the suffering the infant endured, and the callousness of the act represent one of the most evil crimes in this examination of Louisiana maternal cases. This was not a momentary loss of control, not an accident, not negligence. This was a deliberately inflicted act of violence against a completely helpless infant. The investigation into Levi Ellerby's death began when emergency responders were called to a residence in Louisiana where the baby was found with severe burn injuries. The scene immediately indicated that this was not an accidental burning, not a case of an infant being accidentally scalded by bath water or injured in a household fire. The pattern and extent of the burns suggested intentional infliction of injury, leading investigators to treat the case as a potential homicide from the outset. Louisiana State Police and local law enforcement agencies worked together on the investigation. Forensic specialists examined the scene carefully, documenting everything that could help establish what happened to baby Levi. Medical personnel who attempted to treat the infant's injuries provided crucial testimony about the severity of the burns and the suffering the baby must have endured. The medical evidence would prove essential in building the case against Felicia Marie Nicole Smith. The autopsy of 6-month-old Levi Ellerby revealed the full extent of the injuries inflicted upon him. Forensic pathologists documented burn injuries that covered significant portions of the infant's body. The pattern of these burns, their depth, and their distribution all pointed to intentional infliction rather than accidental exposure. The cause of death was determined to be the direct result of these burn injuries, making this a homicide case. Investigators interviewed Felicia Marie Nicole Smith extensively after Levi's death. As with many perpetrators of child abuse, initial explanations for the injuries changed as evidence accumulated. What started as attempts to blame accidental causes gradually shifted as it became clear that the evidence contradicted those explanations. The interviews, documented in police reports and later presented in court, showed a progression from denial to admission as the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. The relationship dynamics in this case added complexity to the investigation. Felicia Marie Nicole Smith was the girlfriend of Levi's biological mother, creating a blended family situation where Smith took on caretaking responsibilities for the infant. Understanding these relationships was crucial to establishing who had access to Levi, who was responsible for his care at the time of the injuries, and whether there had been any prior concerns about Smith's interactions with the baby. Questions naturally arose about whether there had been warning signs that Felicia Marie Nicole Smith posed a danger to baby Levi. Had there been prior incidents of abuse that were not reported or not taken seriously? Were there observations by family members, friends, or others that, in retrospect, suggested Smith should not have been left alone with the infant? These questions haunted the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings. Child Protective Services records were reviewed as part of the investigation. Whenever a child dies under suspicious circumstances, investigators examine whether there had been any prior involvement with child welfare authorities. Had reports been made about the family? Had caseworkers visited the home? Were there any documented concerns about the child's safety? The answers to these questions can help identify systemic failures that may have contributed to a child's death. The prosecution of Felicia Marie Nicole Smith for the murder of 6-month-old Levi Ellerby was pursued with the full resources of the Louisiana criminal justice system. The charges reflected the severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. Under Louisiana law, the killing of children, especially through particularly cruel means, is treated as one of the most serious crimes, warranting the most severe penalties available. The legal process moved forward through the Louisiana court system, with pretrial proceedings addressing various legal questions and procedural matters. The defense team for Felicia Marie Nicole Smith faced an extraordinarily difficult task. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime was horrific, and public sentiment was strongly against the defendant. Crafting any kind of defense in such circumstances requires navigating legal, ethical, and practical challenges. During the trial, prosecutors presented a comprehensive case built on multiple pillars of evidence. Medical testimony explained the nature of the injuries and why they could only have been intentionally inflicted. Law enforcement officers testified about the investigation and the statements made by Smith. Forensic evidence from the scene was presented to show that accidental causes were impossible. The cumulative weight of this evidence pointed unmistakably to Felicia Marie Nicole Smith as the perpetrator. The testimony about baby Levi's injuries was deeply disturbing for everyone in the courtroom. Jurors, many of whom were parents or grandparents themselves, had to view evidence that made clear the suffering endured by this 6-month-old infant. The prosecution's job was to present this evidence in a way that was thorough and convincing while being respectful of the tiny victim whose life had been stolen. The defense's strategy focused on whatever arguments could be made to create doubt or to mitigate the severity of the charges. This might include questioning the medical evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the injuries, or arguing about Smith's mental state at the time of the offense. However, given the overwhelming evidence and the clear nature of the crime, the defense faced an uphill battle from the beginning. Jury deliberations in the Smith case required jurors to carefully consider all the evidence presented and to determine whether the prosecution had proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite the emotional difficulty of the case, jurors took their responsibility seriously, weighing the evidence according to the law and the judge's instructions. The verdict, when it came, reflected the jury's conclusion about what had happened to baby Levi Ellerby. The guilty verdict against Felicia Marie Nicole Smith brought a measure of justice for baby Levi, though nothing could undo the suffering he endured or bring him back to his biological mother and other family members who loved him. The conviction meant that Smith would be held accountable for her horrific actions and that she would face serious punishment for taking an infant's life in such a cruel manner. The sentencing phase of the case provided an opportunity for victim impact statements from Levi's family members. The baby's mother, despite her relationship with Smith, had lost her 6-month-old son in the most traumatic way possible. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and other relatives spoke about the impact of Levi's death on their lives. The statements were heartbreaking, describing the joy that baby Levi had brought to their lives and the devastating void left by his absence. The judge who sentenced Felicia Marie Nicole Smith had to consider the nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, and the need for justice. Burning a 6-month-old baby represents an act of such depravity that it demands the most serious response from the criminal justice system. The sentence imposed reflected these considerations and ensured that Smith would spend a significant portion of her life, if not all of it, in prison for what she did to baby Levi. In the aftermath of the case, discussions arose about how to better protect children in non-traditional family structures. When children are cared for by adults who are not their biological parents, whether step-parents, parents' boyfriends, or girlfriends, or other caregivers, what safeguards should be in place? How can warning signs of potential abuse be identified earlier? These questions don't have easy answers, but cases like Levi Ellerby's death make them urgent. The Louisiana community where this crime occurred struggled to comprehend how anyone could deliberately burn a 6-month-old baby. Vigils were held for baby Levi, with community members coming together to mourn the loss of an innocent life. Local organizations working to prevent child abuse used the case to emphasize the importance of vigilance and the responsibility of everyone to report suspicions of child maltreatment. For law enforcement officers and prosecutors who worked on the case, it remains one of the most difficult of their careers. Investigating and prosecuting the murder of an infant is never easy, but when the method of killing involved burning a 6-month-old baby, the emotional toll is particularly severe. These professionals did their jobs with skill and dedication, ensuring that justice was served for baby Levi, but the cost of working such cases cannot be measured simply in hours or case files. Medical professionals who treated baby Levi in his final moments or who conducted the autopsy similarly carry the weight of this case. Emergency room doctors and nurses who worked desperately to save the infant, pathologists who had to examine his tiny burned body. All of these professionals performed their duties with compassion and professionalism while dealing with the emotional impact of caring for such a young victim of such horrific violence. The case of Felicia Marie Nicole Smith and baby Levi Ellerby stands as one of the most disturbing in Louisiana's recent history of crimes against children. While Smith was not Levi's biological mother, her role as the mother's girlfriend placed her in a position of trust and parental responsibility. Her betrayal of that trust by deliberately burning a 6-month-old infant represents evil in its purest form. The deliberate infliction of agonizing suffering on a completely helpless and innocent child. Baby Levi's short life ended in 2018, but his memory persists. His death was not in vain if it led to greater awareness of child abuse, improved vigilance by those in contact with at-risk children, and renewed commitment to protecting Louisiana's most vulnerable residents. The justice system ensured that his death was thoroughly investigated and that his killer faced serious consequences, providing some measure of closure to his grieving family. As we continue examining cases of maternal violence and violence by those in parental roles, the story of baby Levi Ellerby serves as a particularly harrowing example of how evil can manifest in relationships that should be characterized by love and protection. The fact that he was killed by his mother's girlfriend rather than his mother herself does not diminish the betrayal. It emphasizes that children are vulnerable to anyone placed in a position of trust and authority over them. Case 4. Shalyn Ewing, 2024. A recent tragedy, the death of a 5-month-old son. In 2024, Louisiana experienced yet another case of maternal violence when Shalyn Ewing was accused of killing her 5-month-old son. This recent case is still fresh in the minds of Louisiana residents and may still be working its way through the legal system as of the writing of this documentary. The recency of the case means that some details may not yet be public, but what is known paints a picture of another devastating betrayal of maternal duty. 5-month-old infants are at a particularly precious and vulnerable stage of development. They're beginning to recognize and respond to familiar faces, starting to make consonant sounds and babble, reaching for objects and exploring their environment with their hands and mouths. A 5-month-old is completely dependent on caregivers for every need: feeding, changing, comfort, and protection. The death of an infant at this age, especially at the hands of a mother, represents a profound violation of the trust and dependency that defines the infant-parent relationship. The details that have emerged about the Shalyn Ewing case indicate that this was not an accidental death or a case of sudden infant death syndrome. Instead, investigators determined that the 5-month-old infant died as a result of actions taken by his mother. The specific circumstances of the death became the focus of a criminal investigation that involved law enforcement agencies, medical examiners, and child welfare authorities. When a young infant dies under any circumstances, a thorough investigation is mandatory. Medical examiners must determine the cause of death, ruling out natural causes, accidental death, and homicide. In cases where the death appears suspicious, law enforcement treats the scene as a potential crime scene, documenting everything that might be relevant to understanding what happened. The investigation into the death of Shalyn Ewing's son followed these protocols. The autopsy of the 5-month-old victim provided crucial evidence about how he died. Forensic pathologists examined every aspect of the infant's body, looking for injuries, signs of disease, evidence of malnutrition or neglect, and any other factors that could explain the death. The findings from this examination would determine whether criminal charges were warranted and, if so, what those charges should be. What the medical examiner's office concluded was that this infant's death was the result of inflicted trauma. The specific nature of the injuries indicated that the baby had been harmed by another person, and the circumstances pointed to Shalyn Ewing as the responsible party. This determination transformed what might have initially appeared to be a tragic but natural infant death into a homicide investigation. Louisiana law enforcement officers interviewed Shalyn Ewing multiple times during the investigation. As is common in such cases, investigators carefully documented each interview, noting any changes in the suspect's account of events, any inconsistencies with the physical evidence, and any admissions or statements that could be used in court. The interview process is a crucial component of building a case against a suspect, especially when much of the evidence is circumstantial or medical in nature. The community where Shalyn Ewing lived reacted with shock and grief to the news of the 5-month-old's death. Neighbors who may have seen the mother and infant around the neighborhood struggled to comprehend how such a young baby could die at the hands of his own mother. As details of the case became public through news reports and court filings, the community's shock turned to outrage and demands for justice. Child Protective Services records became part of the investigation, as investigators sought to determine whether there had been any prior concerns about the infant's welfare. Had there been reports to CPS about the family? Had caseworkers been involved? Were there any services in place to support the family or to monitor the child's safety? The answers to these questions could help identify whether opportunities to prevent the tragedy had been missed. The role of family members in cases like this is often complicated. Shalyn Ewing's family may have loved the 5-month-old victim and been devastated by his death, but they may also have felt conflicted about seeing their daughter or family member charged with murder. Extended family members who spoke with investigators may have provided information about any concerns they had regarding the infant's care or about Shalyn Ewing's mental state or behavior. Mental health evaluations of Shalyn Ewing likely became part of the legal proceedings. In cases of maternal filicide involving young infants, defense attorneys often argue that severe postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis played a role in the crime. While such conditions are real and can be severe, they don't necessarily excuse criminal behavior, and the question of whether they were present and whether they diminish legal responsibility becomes a key issue in many such cases. The charges filed against Shalyn Ewing reflected the prosecution's determination that she was criminally responsible for her 5-month-old son's death. The specific charges would depend on the evidence of intent, premeditation, and the exact circumstances of the death. In Louisiana, as in all states, there are various degrees of homicide charges, ranging from negligent homicide through manslaughter to various degrees of murder. As the case moves through the Louisiana criminal justice system, pretrial proceedings address numerous legal questions. Can certain evidence be admitted at trial? What expert witnesses will testify? Will the defense present an insanity or diminished capacity defense? These and many other questions are resolved through pretrial motions and hearings, with the judge making rulings that will shape how the trial proceeds. The prosecution in the Ewing case is building a comprehensive case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Shalyn Ewing caused her son's death and that her actions meet the legal definition of the crime charged. This involves presenting medical evidence, law enforcement testimony, physical evidence from the scene, and any statements made by the defendant. The goal is to leave the jury with no reasonable doubt about what happened and who was responsible. The defense team for Shalyn Ewing faces the challenge of defending a client accused of killing her own 5-month-old son. This might involve challenging the medical evidence, presenting alternative explanations for the death, arguing that Ewing lacked the mental capacity to form the intent necessary for the crime charged, or seeking to mitigate the potential punishment by presenting evidence of mental illness or other factors that might warrant leniency. If the case goes to trial, jurors will hear testimony that is likely to be emotionally difficult. Evidence about the death of a 5-month-old infant, photographs of injuries, testimony from medical examiners about the cause of death. All of this creates an emotionally charged atmosphere in the courtroom. Jurors must set aside natural emotional reactions and focus on whether the prosecution has met its burden of proof according to the law. Victim impact statements, when they are presented during sentencing, will likely come from the infant's father if he was not involved in the crime, from grandparents, and from other family members who love the 5-month-old boy. These statements provide the court with information about the impact of the death on the family and community, helping the judge determine an appropriate sentence if there is a conviction. The sentence that Shalyn Ewing could face if convicted depends on the specific charges and the circumstances of the case. In Louisiana, the murder of an infant carries severe penalties, reflecting society's commitment to protecting children and punishing those who harm them. The judge would consider the nature of the crime, any mitigating or aggravating factors, and the requirements of justice in determining a sentence. Because this case is so recent, ongoing developments may continue to shape the story. Additional evidence may come to light. Plea negotiations may result in a resolution without trial, or the case may proceed to trial where all facts will be presented publicly. The recency of the case means that updates should be sought from reliable news sources and court records for the most current information. The death of Shalyn Ewing's 5-month-old son adds to the tragic toll of maternal violence in Louisiana. Each case involves unique circumstances and individuals, but common threads run through many of these cases. The vulnerability of infant victims, the betrayal of parental trust, the devastating impact on families and communities, and the difficult questions about how such tragedies can be prevented. Child advocacy organizations in Louisiana have used recent cases like this one to emphasize the importance of support services for new mothers. Postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis are real medical conditions that can impair judgment and, in extreme cases, contribute to violence against children. However, the vast majority of women who experience these conditions do not harm their children, and having these conditions does not excuse violence even if they help explain it. Healthcare providers who work with new mothers are trained to screen for postpartum depression and other mental health concerns. Questions about mood, anxiety, intrusive thoughts about harming the baby, and other symptoms are standard parts of postpartum care. When concerns are identified, referrals for mental health treatment should follow. The question in cases like Shalyn Ewing's is whether there were warning signs that were missed or not taken seriously enough. The broader community response to cases like this often includes calls for better access to mental health services, more thorough follow-up care for new mothers, and improved training for healthcare providers in identifying mothers at risk. While these systemic improvements may help prevent some cases, they cannot eliminate all risk, especially when individuals deliberately conceal their struggles or when violence occurs for reasons unrelated to postpartum mental health conditions. For law enforcement and prosecutors working the Ewing case, the recent nature of the investigation means they're still actively engaged in building the case and preparing for legal proceedings. Unlike cases from years or decades past, this one remains dynamic, with new developments potentially emerging as the legal process continues. The professionals involved carry the weight of seeking justice for a 5-month-old victim while ensuring that the defendant's constitutional rights are protected. The 5-month-old boy who died in 2024 at his mother's hands will not grow up, will not experience childhood, will not have the opportunities that should have been his. His brief life ended before it barely began, stolen by the person who should have been his greatest protector. As the case proceeds through the Louisiana justice system, his memory serves as a reminder of why this work matters and why society must remain vigilant in protecting its most vulnerable members. The Shalyn Ewing case, being so recent, is still unfolding. Final outcomes have not been determined, and the full truth of what happened may not be known until trial or until a plea agreement is reached. What is certain is that a 5-month-old infant is dead, a mother is accused of killing him, and another Louisiana community is left grappling with the incomprehensible tragedy of maternal violence. Case 5, Aaliyah Jack, 2024. The double betrayal, one child killed, another abandoned. Also in 2024, Louisiana saw another horrific case of maternal violence, this one involving Aaliyah Jack, who was accused of killing her 4-year-old son and abandoning her 1-year-old child. This case is particularly disturbing because it involves not just one but 2 children victimized by their mother's actions. One killed, the other left in circumstances that could easily have resulted in a second death. 4-year-old children are at a wonderful stage of development. They're talking in full sentences, asking endless questions, developing friendships, learning to share and cooperate, beginning to understand rules and consequences. A 4-year-old has a personality, preferences, fears, and dreams. They're individuals in their own right, dependent on parents for care and protection, but increasingly able to interact with the wider world. The death of a 4-year-old represents the loss of a unique human being with years of potential ahead. 1-year-old children are at a different, but equally vulnerable stage. They're typically taking their first steps, saying their first words, exploring everything within reach, and completely dependent on adults for survival. A 1-year-old left alone is in immediate danger, unable to feed themselves, seek help, or protect themselves from hazards. The abandonment of a 1-year-old child is a potentially lethal act of neglect. Aaliyah Jack's actions toward both of her children represented fundamental violations of maternal duty. The killing of her 4-year-old son was an act of violence against a child who should have been safe in his mother's care. The abandonment of her 1-year-old child was an act of neglect so severe that it could have resulted in a second child's death if the baby hadn't been found in time. Together, these acts paint a picture of a mother who completely abandoned her responsibilities to her children. The investigation into this case began when the body of the 4-year-old boy was discovered. The circumstances of the discovery immediately indicated that this was not a natural death or an accident. Law enforcement responded to the scene and began the process of determining what had happened, who was responsible, and whether there were other victims or other individuals at risk. As investigators worked the scene where the 4-year-old's body was found, they learned that Aaliyah Jack had another child, a 1-year-old who was not present at the scene. This discovery triggered an urgent search for the missing baby, with law enforcement fearing the worst. The frantic search involved multiple agencies and community members who were mobilized to help find the 1-year-old before it was too late. The 1-year-old was eventually located, alive, but in circumstances that indicated he had been abandoned by his mother. The condition of the child when found provided evidence of how long he had been without proper care and how close he had come to suffering the same fate as his older brother. The discovery of the baby alive was a relief to investigators and the community, but it did not diminish the severity of the charges Aaliyah Jack would face. The autopsy of the 4-year-old victim revealed how he died and provided evidence about the circumstances surrounding his death. Forensic pathologists documented injuries or other findings that helped establish whether the death was intentional, negligent, or accidental. The medical evidence would be crucial to the prosecution's case against Aaliyah Jack, providing objective scientific findings that would support or refute various theories about what happened. Interviews with Aaliyah Jack became a central part of the investigation. Detectives questioned her about her movements, her actions toward both children, and the circumstances that led to the death of one child and the abandonment of the other. As is often the case in homicide investigations, the suspect's statements contained inconsistencies and contradictions that investigators used to challenge her account and uncover the truth. The question of motive in cases like this is always difficult. Why would a mother kill one child and abandon another? Investigators explored various possibilities. Was this an act of rage, mental breakdown, deliberate cruelty, or something else? Understanding motive is important not just for solving the case, but also for determining appropriate charges and for helping the community comprehend the incomprehensible. Child Protective Services records were reviewed to determine whether there had been prior concerns about Aaliyah Jack's care of her children. Had teachers, daycare workers, family members, or neighbors ever reported suspected abuse or neglect? Had CPS investigated the family? Were there any services in place to support the family? The answers to these questions would help determine whether the tragedy could have been prevented through earlier intervention. The prosecution of Aaliyah Jack involved multiple serious charges reflecting her actions toward both children. The killing of the 4-year-old would result in homicide charges of some degree, while the abandonment of the 1-year-old would result in child endangerment or similar charges. Together, these charges reflected the full scope of Jack's criminal behavior and the threat she posed to her own children. The community response to this case was one of horror and outrage. The fact that one child was killed while another was abandoned to potentially die struck at the heart of every parent's worst fears. Vigils were held for the 4-year-old victim, with community members gathering to mourn a child they may never have known, but whose death affected them deeply. The 1-year-old survivor became the focus of concern and support as arrangements were made for his long-term care. Family members of the children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and the children's father, if he was involved in their lives, had to grapple with the dual traumas of losing one child to murder and nearly losing another to abandonment. The family dynamics in such cases are incredibly complex, as relatives must balance grief, anger at the perpetrator, and concern for the surviving child, while also dealing with their own shock and trauma. The legal proceedings in the Jack case would involve navigating multiple charges and potentially multiple victims' advocates representing the interests of both the deceased 4-year-old and the surviving 1-year-old. The prosecution would need to present evidence about both sets of actions, the killing and the abandonment, to give the court and jury a complete picture of Aaliyah Jack's criminal behavior. Defense attorneys representing Aaliyah Jack faced the difficult task of defending a client accused of killing one child and abandoning another. The defense strategy might involve mental health arguments, challenges to the evidence, or attempts to mitigate potential punishment by presenting factors that might explain, if not excuse, Jack's actions. However, the dual nature of the crimes, affecting 2 children in different ways, made the defense's task particularly challenging. If the case proceeds to trial, jurors will hear evidence about both children and both sets of criminal acts. They'll see evidence related to the 4-year-old's death and hear testimony about the condition in which the 1-year-old was found after being abandoned. The emotional impact of this evidence on jurors cannot be underestimated, and the judge would need to ensure that jurors could render a verdict based on evidence and law rather than pure emotion. The question of sentencing in a case involving multiple child victims is complex. Should sentences for separate crimes be served consecutively or concurrently? What factors should the judge consider in determining an appropriate punishment? The death of one child and the near death of another through abandonment represent serious aggravating factors that would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence if Aaliyah Jack is convicted. Victim impact statements in this case would come from family members speaking on behalf of the 4-year-old who died and the 1-year-old who survived, but may carry emotional scars from his ordeal. The statements would describe the impact of Jack's actions on the entire family, the loss of the 4-year-old, and the ongoing concerns about the well-being of the surviving child as he grows up knowing what his mother did. The 1-year-old survivor faces a long road ahead. Psychologists who work with traumatized children note that even young children can be affected by severe neglect and by the trauma of losing a sibling. As the child grows older, he will need to be told about what happened to his brother and why. Caregivers, whether relatives who adopt him or foster parents who provide his care, will need to help him process this history and build a stable, nurturing environment where he can heal and thrive. Child welfare agencies became involved in determining the best placement for the surviving 1-year-old. Relatives may have sought custody, or the child may have entered the foster care system if suitable family placements were not available. The goal in such cases is always to find a permanent, loving home where the child can grow up safely, free from the trauma that characterized his earliest months of life. The Aaliyah Jack case highlights the vulnerability of children to maternal violence and neglect. The 4-year-old who died was old enough to understand that his mother should protect him, making the betrayal even more profound. The 1-year-old who was abandoned was too young to understand what was happening, but was nonetheless placed in mortal danger by his mother's actions. Both children were victimized by the person who should have been their primary protector. In the aftermath of the case, discussions arose about the warning signs of severe child abuse and neglect. Were there indicators that Aaliyah Jack was a danger to her children? Could friends, family members, or professionals who interacted with the family have intervened earlier? These questions are asked after every case of severe child maltreatment, reflecting society's desperate desire to find ways to prevent such tragedies. The dual nature of the Jack case, one child killed, another abandoned, makes it particularly disturbing even among cases of maternal violence. It suggests a level of disregard for her children's welfare that went beyond even the single act of violence seen in other cases. The systematic nature of victimizing both children in different ways speaks to a profound failure of maternal instinct and responsibility. For law enforcement and prosecutors working the case, the complexity of dealing with 2 child victims and multiple criminal acts requires careful coordination and comprehensive evidence gathering. Every aspect of Aaliyah Jack's interactions with both children must be documented and analyzed. The timeline of events must be reconstructed to show when each child was victimized and under what circumstances. This work is essential to building a case that will hold up in court and result in justice for both children. The media coverage of cases like Aaliyah Jack's walks a fine line between informing the public and respecting the victims. The 4-year-old who died deserves to be remembered as a person, not just as a victim. The 1-year-old survivor deserves privacy as he grows up and heals from his traumatic start in life. Responsible journalism reports the facts of the case while protecting the dignity of the children involved. Community organizations working to prevent child abuse have used the Jack case as an example of why everyone in a community must be vigilant. Teachers, doctors, neighbors, family members, anyone who interacts with children has a responsibility to report suspicions of abuse or neglect. While reporting concerns doesn't guarantee that tragedy will be prevented, failing to report when red flags are present can have devastating consequences. The 4-year-old boy who died at his mother's hands in 2024 is gone, but his memory persists. Those who knew him remember his personality, his smile, the things that made him unique. The 1-year-old who survived has a chance at life because someone found him before it was too late. As the Jack case proceeds through the legal system, both children remain at the center of the pursuit of justice. One whose life was stolen, the other whose life was saved, but forever marked by his mother's actions. Case 6. Hannah Faith Cormier, 2024. The hot car death of a 10-month-old daughter. The year 2024 brought yet another tragedy to Louisiana when Hannah Faith Cormier left her 10-month-old daughter in a hot car, resulting in the child's death. Hot car deaths of children have become an increasingly recognized problem across the United States, and Louisiana's hot climate makes such incidents particularly dangerous. However, the question in cases like this is always whether the death was a tragic accident or a case of criminal negligence rising to the level of homicide. 10-month-old children are beautiful, active, curious babies. They're typically crawling, maybe pulling themselves up to stand, saying their first words, and showing distinct preferences and personality traits. A 10-month-old is completely dependent on adults for care, but is interactive enough to clearly express needs and emotions. The death of a child this age is always tragic, but when it occurs because a parent left the baby in a hot car, questions of responsibility and criminality inevitably arise. Hot car deaths typically occur in one of several scenarios. A parent or caregiver forgets the child is in the car and leaves them there while going to work or running errands. A parent intentionally leaves a child in the car while making a quick stop, not realizing how rapidly temperatures rise inside vehicles. Or, in the most disturbing cases, a child is left in a hot car deliberately as a form of punishment or with the intent to cause harm. Determining which scenario occurred is crucial to understanding both what happened and what criminal charges are appropriate. The investigation into Hannah Faith Cormier's 10-month-old daughter's death began when emergency responders were called to the scene where the child was found in the vehicle. First responders attempted life-saving measures, but the baby could not be revived. The scene was immediately treated as a potential crime scene, with investigators documenting the vehicle's condition, the temperature, how long the child had been left in the car, and the circumstances that led to the child being there. Medical examiners determined that the cause of death was hyperthermia, the medical term for the dangerous elevation of body temperature that occurs when someone is exposed to high heat. In hot cars, temperatures can rise rapidly, even on days that don't feel excessively hot outside. A child's body temperature rises 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's, making them particularly vulnerable to heat-related death. The autopsy in this case would document the physical evidence of heat exposure and death from hyperthermia. The science of hot car deaths is well established. Research has shown that when outside temperatures are in the 70s Fahrenheit, the temperature inside a closed car can reach fatal levels in as little as 20 to 30 minutes. In Louisiana's hot climate, where summer temperatures routinely exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of a car can reach 120 degrees or higher in a very short time. These conditions are fatal for young children who cannot escape and whose bodies cannot regulate temperature effectively. Investigators interviewed Hannah Faith Cormier extensively to determine the circumstances that led to her daughter being left in the hot car. Was this a case of forgotten baby syndrome, where a disruption in routine causes a parent to forget the child is in the car? Was it a case of intentionally leaving the child just for a minute that turned tragic? Or was there evidence of more deliberate intent to harm? The answers to these questions would determine what criminal charges were appropriate. Forgotten baby syndrome is a recognized phenomenon where parents, due to changes in routine or stress, genuinely forget that their child is in the car. This typically occurs when a parent who doesn't usually handle daycare drop-off is doing so, or when routine is disrupted in some way. While this explains how such tragedies occur, it doesn't necessarily absolve parents of criminal responsibility, especially if there were opportunities to remember the child or if the parent failed to take reasonable precautions. The question of criminal intent is central to hot car death cases. If a parent genuinely forgot the child was in the car and had no reason to remember before it was too late, the case may be charged as negligent homicide or a similar charge reflecting lack of intent but culpable negligence. If a parent knowingly left the child in the car, even for a short time, the charges may be more serious. And if there's evidence of deliberate intent to harm the child, the charges could include murder. In Hannah Faith Cormier's case, the specific charges filed reflected prosecutors' determination about her level of culpability. The investigation examined her actions before and after leaving the child in the car, her statements about what happened, and whether those statements were consistent with the physical evidence. Any history of prior incidents where the child was left in dangerous situations would also be relevant to assessing criminal responsibility. The community where this tragedy occurred reacted with a mixture of sympathy and anger. Some people felt that any parent could make a tragic mistake and that prosecuting grieving parents who have lost a child adds to the tragedy. Others argued that parents have an absolute responsibility to ensure their children's safety and that leaving a child in a hot car, whether intentionally or through carelessness, should be criminally punished. These competing perspectives often surface in hot car death cases. Child advocacy organizations have worked to raise awareness about hot car deaths and to promote preventive strategies. Recommendations include always checking the back seat before leaving a car, placing something essential, like a purse or phone, in the back seat to force a check, using technology-based reminders, and being especially vigilant during routine changes. Some advocates push for technology that would alert parents when a child is left in a car or that would prevent cars from being locked when motion sensors detect a child inside. The legal proceedings in the Cormier case would involve presenting evidence about exactly what happened, how long the child was in the car, what the temperature conditions were, and what Hannah Faith Cormier's actions and statements indicated about her awareness and intent. Expert testimony about how quickly cars heat up and how hyperthermia causes death would help the jury understand the medical aspects of the case. The defense in such cases often focuses on the tragic accident narrative, emphasizing the parent's grief and the lack of intent to harm. Defense attorneys may present evidence of the parent's good character, their previous care for the child, and the changes in routine or other circumstances that led to the fatal mistake. The goal is to generate sympathy and to convince the jury that criminal punishment on top of the loss of a child is excessive. However, prosecutors in such cases argue that parents have a fundamental duty to ensure their children's safety and that failure to meet this duty, resulting in a child's death, cannot go unpunished regardless of the parent's grief. The prosecution would emphasize that the 10-month-old victim had no ability to save herself, that she died a painful death from heat exposure, and that Hannah Faith Cormier's actions or inactions directly caused this death. If the case goes to trial, jurors must grapple with the difficult question of whether a parent's mistake, even one with fatal consequences, should result in criminal punishment. The jury instructions would explain the elements of whatever crime is charged and the burden of proof the prosecution must meet. Jurors would have to determine whether Hannah Faith Cormier's conduct met the legal definition of the crime, setting aside sympathy or anger to focus on the evidence and the law. Victim impact statements in hot car death cases are particularly poignant because the child's death was potentially preventable. Family members speak about the loss of the 10-month-old baby, the future that was stolen from her, and the impact of her death on the entire family. If there's anger toward Hannah Faith Cormier from other family members, this may be expressed in victim impact statements. If there's sympathy and a view that she's being punished enough by her grief, this too may be communicated to the court. The question of sentencing in hot car death cases varies widely depending on the specific charges and circumstances. Some parents have received probation, others have received prison sentences of varying lengths. The judge must consider whether the defendant poses a future danger to children, whether punishment serves any purpose given that the parent has already lost a child, and what sentence reflects both justice for the victim and appropriate mercy toward a grieving parent. The 10-month-old who died in Hannah Faith Cormier's car will never celebrate her first birthday, never take her first steps, never say mama or dada, never experience any of the milestones that should have been hers. Her death, whether the result of a tragic mistake or criminal negligence, was preventable. That knowledge haunts everyone connected to the case and drives efforts to ensure that other children don't suffer the same fate. In the aftermath of the case, Louisiana communities have increased awareness efforts about hot car dangers. Public service announcements, social media campaigns, and community presentations educate parents and caregivers about the risks and about strategies to prevent such tragedies. While these efforts cannot bring back the children who have already died, they may save future lives by keeping hot car dangers in the forefront of parents' minds. The Cormier case represents a different type of maternal failure than the deliberate acts of violence seen in other cases in this documentary. Whether her actions were criminal negligence or a tragic accident, Hannah Faith Cormier's failure to ensure her daughter's safety resulted in the child's death. The legal system's role is to determine whether criminal punishment is warranted and, if so, what form that punishment should take. For child protection advocates, hot car deaths represent a particularly frustrating category of child fatalities because they are entirely preventable. Simple changes in behavior, always checking the back seat, using reminders, never leaving children alone in cars even for a minute, would eliminate these deaths. The challenge is how to ensure that parents consistently follow these practices even when stressed, distracted, or dealing with routine changes. The 10-month-old daughter of Hannah Faith Cormier is remembered by family members who loved her. Her brief life and tragic death have become part of Louisiana's record of children lost to preventable causes. Whether the legal system ultimately treats her death as a crime requiring punishment or as a tragedy that has already punished the parent enough through grief, the central fact remains: a 10-month-old baby died in circumstances that should never have occurred. Case 7. Bunnak, Hannah, Landon, 2023. The death of 6-year-old Bella Fontanelle. In 2023, Louisiana experienced another case of violence against a child by someone in a parental role when Bunnak, Landon was accused of killing her boyfriend's 6-year-old daughter, Bella Fontanelle. This case, like the Felicia Marie Nicole Smith case, involves a woman who was not the child's biological mother but was acting in a parental capacity through her relationship with the child's father. The betrayal of trust in such cases is profound, as children in blended families are particularly vulnerable to abuse from non-biological parents. 6-year-old Bella Fontanelle was at an age of wonder and growth. 6-year-olds are typically in kindergarten or first grade, learning to read, making friends, developing independence while still needing parental guidance and protection. A 6-year-old has a distinct personality, preferences, fears, and dreams. They're old enough to understand when they're being hurt and to fear those who harm them, but often too young to effectively protect themselves or seek help. The death of a 6-year-old at the hands of a trusted adult represents a profound betrayal of the child's dependence and trust. The relationship dynamics in this case are important to understanding what happened. Bunnak, Landon was in a relationship with Bella's father, placing her in a parental or quasi-parental role in the child's life. Children in such situations are often vulnerable because they may spend time alone with their parent's boyfriend or girlfriend, and because the biological parent may not initially recognize or believe that their partner is harming their child. Step-parents and parents' romantic partners statistically pose higher risks to children than biological parents, making vigilance particularly important in such situations. The investigation into Bella Fontanelle's death began when the 6-year-old was found deceased or was taken to a hospital with fatal injuries. The circumstances immediately raised suspicions that this was not a natural death or accident. Law enforcement responded and began the process of determining what had happened to Bella, who was responsible, and what charges should be filed. The investigation would involve careful examination of the scene, interviews with everyone who had contact with Bella, and medical examination to determine the cause of death. The autopsy of 6-year-old Bella revealed injuries that were consistent with inflicted trauma. Forensic pathologists documented the nature and extent of the injuries, the likely timing of when they occurred, and whether they were consistent with the explanations being offered by Bunnak, Landon, or others present in the home. The medical evidence would be crucial to establishing that Bella's death was a homicide and that the injuries could not have been accidentally inflicted. Interviews with Bunnak, Landon became a central focus of the investigation. Detectives questioned her about her interactions with Bella, the events leading up to the child's death, and her explanations for how Bella sustained her fatal injuries. As is common in homicide investigations, Landon's statements were carefully documented and compared to the physical evidence and to statements from other witnesses. Inconsistencies in her account raised investigative red flags. The role of Bella's biological father in this case raises difficult questions. Was he present when Bella was injured or killed? Did he participate in the abuse, fail to protect his daughter from Landon, or was he genuinely unaware of the danger Landon posed to his child? The answers to these questions would affect both the investigation and the question of whether the father bore any legal or moral responsibility for Bella's death. Extended family members, Bella's mother if she was living and involved in Bella's life, grandparents, aunts, uncles, would have been devastated by the 6-year-old's death. Their perspectives on Bella's life, her relationship with Landon, and any concerns they may have had about her safety became part of the investigation. If family members had previously expressed concerns about Bella's welfare to her father or to authorities, this would be relevant to understanding whether warning signs had been present but ignored. Child Protective Services records were reviewed as part of the investigation. Had there been any prior reports of concerns about Bella's welfare? Had CPS investigated the home where Bella lived with her father and Landon? Were there any services in place to support the family or monitor Bella's safety? The answers to these questions could reveal whether opportunities to intervene and protect Bella had existed but been missed. The prosecution of Bunnak, Landon for Bella's death involved careful charging decisions. The specific charges would reflect the evidence of intent and the circumstances of the killing. In Louisiana, as in all states, the murder of a child by someone in a parental role is treated with particular severity. Even though Landon was not Bella's biological mother, Her position in the household and her relationship with Bella's father placed her in a position of authority and trust over the child. The community where Bella lived and where she attended school reacted with grief and outrage to her death. 6-year-olds are at an age where they're known in their communities. They attend school, participate in activities, have friends whose parents know them. Bella's death affected not just her family, but also her classmates, teachers, neighbors, and others in the community who knew her or knew of her. Vigils were likely held, and grief counselors probably worked with Bella's classmates to help them process the loss. The trial, when it occurred, brought the full details of Bella's death into public view. Medical examiners testified about the injuries that killed the 6-year-old and explained why these injuries indicated intentional harm rather than accidental trauma. Law enforcement officers described the investigation and the statements made by Landon. If there were witnesses to abuse or individuals who had seen warning signs, their testimony would be crucial to establishing the full picture of what Bella endured. The defense team for Bunnak Landon faced the challenge of defending a client accused of killing her boyfriend's 6-year-old daughter. Defense strategies might include challenging the medical evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for Bella's injuries, or presenting evidence about Landon's character or circumstances that might mitigate her culpability. However, cases involving the death of children are among the most difficult to defend, especially when the medical evidence clearly indicates intentional harm. Jurors in the case had to hear and evaluate disturbing evidence about the death of a 6-year-old child. The emotional impact of such evidence can be significant, and jurors must be able to set aside natural reactions of horror and sympathy to focus on whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury instructions would explain the legal elements of the charges and the standard of proof required for conviction. If Bunnak Landon was convicted, the sentencing phase would involve victim impact statements from Bella's family members. Her biological parents, if both were alive and not complicit in the abuse, would likely provide statements about the impact of Bella's death on their lives. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and other relatives would describe who Bella was as a person and what her loss meant to the family. These statements would provide the court with a full picture of the human cost of the crime. The sentence imposed on Landon would reflect Louisiana's commitment to protecting children and punishing those who harm them. The judge would consider the nature of the crime, Bella's vulnerability as a 6-year-old child, the betrayal of the parental role Landon occupied in Bella's life, and any other aggravating or mitigating circumstances. The sentence would likely be substantial, reflecting the severity of taking a young child's life. The case of Bella Fontanelle highlights the particular vulnerability of children in blended families or households where they live with a parent's boyfriend or girlfriend. Research has consistently shown that children face higher risks of abuse from non-biological parents than from biological parents. This doesn't mean that most step-parents or parents' partners abuse children. The vast majority do not. But it does mean that vigilance is particularly important in such situations. For Bella's biological parents, if both survived her and were not complicit in the abuse, the guilt and grief must be overwhelming. Parents trust their romantic partners around their children, and discovering that this trust was betrayed and resulted in a child's death creates psychological trauma that can last a lifetime. The question of whether warning signs were missed haunts parents in such situations, even when abuse is carefully hidden from them. 6-year-old Bella Fontanelle should have been excited about school, playing with friends, and experiencing the joy of childhood. Instead, her life was cut short by someone who should have helped care for and protect her. Bella's death in 2023 added to Louisiana's tragic toll of children killed by those in parental roles. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her and in the commitment of the community to ensure such tragedies are prevented whenever possible. The Landon case serves as a reminder that child protection cannot focus solely on biological parents. Anyone who has regular access to children and authority over them poses a potential risk if they're inclined to abuse. Teachers, coaches, childcare providers, and, significantly, parents' romantic partners all need to be understood as having the potential to harm children if there are no effective safeguards and monitoring in place. Child protective services and law enforcement agencies struggle with the challenge of identifying and intervening in cases where children are at risk from non-biological parents or caregivers. The warning signs may be similar to those in biological parent abuse cases. Unexplained injuries, changes in behavior, fear of a particular adult, reluctance to go home. However, biological parents may be particularly resistant to believing that their romantic partner is harming their child, making intervention more complicated. Bella Fontanelle's case remains a tragic example of what can happen when a child is entrusted to someone who violates that trust in the most fundamental way. Bunnak, Hannah, Landon's prosecution and conviction, if that was the outcome, ensured that justice was served and that Bella's death was not ignored or dismissed. For those who investigate and prosecute such cases, the work is emotionally difficult but essential to protecting vulnerable children and holding perpetrators accountable. Case 8. Jasmine Anderson, 2019. The death of a 5-year-old daughter. In 2019, Louisiana saw another case of maternal violence when Jasmine Anderson was accused of killing her 5-year-old daughter. This case added to the disturbing pattern of mothers harming their own children that has marked Louisiana's recent criminal history. 5-year-old children are at a precious age, old enough to have distinct personalities and relationships, but young enough to be completely dependent on their parents for care and protection. 5-year-old children are typically in kindergarten, learning academic and social skills that will form the foundation for their educational journey. They're developing friendships, learning to navigate conflicts, discovering their own interests and preferences. A 5-year-old is verbal enough to express needs and feelings, but may not be sophisticated enough to effectively seek help when being abused or to understand that they can report abuse to trusted adults like teachers. The investigation into the death of Jasmine Anderson's 5-year-old daughter began when the child was found deceased or arrived at a hospital with fatal injuries. The circumstances immediately raised concerns that this was not a natural death, triggering a full criminal investigation. Louisiana law enforcement agencies responded, beginning the meticulous work of documenting the scene, interviewing witnesses, and gathering evidence that would establish what happened and who was responsible. The autopsy of the 5-year-old victim provided crucial evidence about the cause of death. Forensic pathologists examined the child's body comprehensively, documenting all injuries and determining which were fatal and which, if any, were older injuries indicating a pattern of abuse. The medical examiner's findings would establish whether this death resulted from intentional harm, negligent behavior, or accidental causes. What the autopsy revealed was consistent with inflicted trauma, injuries that could not be explained by childhood accidents or natural causes. The pattern, severity, and location of injuries told a story of violence directed at a vulnerable 5-year-old child. These medical findings became the foundation of the case against Jasmine Anderson, providing objective scientific evidence that complemented witness statements and physical evidence from the scene. Interviews with Jasmine Anderson formed a central component of the investigation. Detectives questioned her extensively about her relationship with her daughter, the events leading to the child's death, and her explanations for how the fatal injuries occurred. As often happens in such investigations, Anderson's account may have contained inconsistencies or may have been contradicted by physical evidence, leading investigators to focus more intensively on her as the primary suspect. The investigation also examined the child's history. Were there prior reports of abuse or neglect? Had teachers or other mandated reporters noticed injuries or behavioral changes that concerned them? Had family members observed anything that raised red flags about the child's safety? The answers to these questions would help establish whether there had been opportunities to intervene before the situation escalated to a fatal outcome. Child Protective Services records became part of the investigative file. If there had been prior CPS involvement with the Anderson family, the nature of that involvement, the findings of any investigations, and the services that may have been provided all became relevant to understanding the context of the child's death. If CPS had been involved but had concluded that the child was safe, questions would arise about whether that determination was correct. School records from the kindergarten the 5-year-old attended also became part of the investigation. Teachers and school staff were interviewed about their observations of the child. Was the child's attendance regular or sporadic? Did the child arrive at school with injuries? Were there behavioral concerns that might indicate problems at home? Schools are often the front line in identifying child abuse, making educator observations crucial to understanding a child's situation. The prosecution of Jasmine Anderson moved forward based on the accumulated evidence. The charges filed reflected the severity of the crime and the relationship between perpetrator and victim. In Louisiana, as in all states, the murder of one's own child is viewed as among the most serious crimes, warranting the most severe penalties available under law. The prosecution would present a comprehensive case showing that Anderson caused her daughter's death through deliberate acts of violence. The trial, when it occurred, brought the community face to face with the full horror of what had happened to the 5-year-old victim. Medical testimony detailed the injuries that killed her. Law enforcement described the investigation. If there were witnesses who had seen abuse or had been aware of concerning situations, their testimony would paint a picture of a child who was not adequately protected from her own mother. The defense team for Jasmine Anderson had the difficult task of defending against child murder charges. Defense strategies might have included mental health arguments, challenges to the medical or forensic evidence, or attempts to present alternative explanations for the child's death. However, the evidence in such cases is typically overwhelming, making effective defense extremely challenging. Jurors in the Anderson case had to evaluate evidence that was emotionally difficult but legally determinative. The photographs, medical testimony, and other evidence about the death of a 5-year-old child would be disturbing, but jurors had to focus on whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Jasmine Anderson caused her daughter's death through criminal conduct. The burden of proof remained on the prosecution, regardless of how horrific the alleged crime. Victim impact statements during the sentencing phase would come from family members who loved the 5-year-old victim, grandparents, aunts, uncles, the child's father if he was involved in her life. All would have the opportunity to describe the impact of the child's death on their lives and on the family as a whole. These statements would be heartbreaking, describing a bright, beautiful child whose life was cut short by her own mother. The sentence imposed on Jasmine Anderson if she was convicted would reflect the severity of the crime. The judge would consider the child's vulnerability, the betrayal of maternal duty, the evidence of premeditation or deliberation if present, and any mitigating factors that might warrant consideration. The sentence would likely be lengthy, ensuring that Anderson would spend many years or potentially the rest of her life in prison for what she did to her 5-year-old daughter. The community where the Anderson family lived struggled to comprehend how a mother could kill her own 5-year-old child. Vigils were held, with community members gathering to remember the young victim and to express their grief and anger. The child's kindergarten classmates would have needed significant support to process the loss of their friend, with grief counselors working with the school to help young children cope with death and loss. The question of prevention haunted those who reviewed the Anderson case. Were there opportunities to intervene that were missed? Did people see warning signs but fail to report them? Or did they report concerns that were not adequately addressed? Child protection advocates used the case to emphasize the importance of reporting suspicions of abuse and ensuring that reports are thoroughly investigated by child protective services and law enforcement. For the investigators and prosecutors who worked the Anderson case, it represented the most difficult type of criminal matter, one involving the death of an innocent child at the hands of her own mother. The professional satisfaction of securing justice for the victim is tempered by the emotional toll of working such cases and by the knowledge that the victim can never be brought back or the suffering she endured be undone. The 5-year-old daughter of Jasmine Anderson had dreams and potential that will never be realized. She should have had a childhood full of learning and play, an adolescence of growth and discovery, and an adulthood of achievement and relationships. All of this was stolen from her by her own mother, the person who should have been her greatest protector. Her death in 2019 added to Louisiana's tragic roll of children killed by maternal violence. The Anderson case serves as another sobering example of how the people children should be able to trust most can sometimes be their greatest danger. 5-year-old children depend entirely on their parents for survival and should be able to trust that their needs will be met and that they will be kept safe. When a mother violates this trust through violence, the betrayal is complete and the damage irreparable. In remembrance of the 5-year-old victim, community organizations in Louisiana continue to work on preventing child abuse through education, early intervention services, and support for struggling families. While these efforts cannot bring back the children already lost, They represent a commitment to ensuring that future generations of Louisiana children are better protected from violence within their own homes. Case 9. Lanaya Cardwell, 2021. The death of a 2-year-old daughter. In 2021, Lanaya Cardwell became another Louisiana mother accused of killing her own child when her 2-year-old daughter died under circumstances that investigators determined were homicidal. 2-year-old children are at a particularly precious stage of development, the terrible twos, when toddlers are asserting independence, testing boundaries, and sometimes challenging parental patience. However, the developmental challenges of parenting a 2-year-old never justify violence against a child. 2-year-old children are typically mobile, verbal, curious, and energetic. They're learning language rapidly, expressing preferences, and developing their own personalities. They require constant supervision because their curiosity exceeds their judgment, leading them into potential dangers if not watched carefully. A 2-year-old is completely dependent on caregivers for food, shelter, safety, and emotional support. The death of a child this age represents the loss of a unique individual who was just beginning to discover the world. The investigation into the death of Lanaya Cardwell's 2-year-old daughter began when authorities were notified of the child's death. The circumstances raised immediate concerns that this was not a natural death or accident, prompting a full criminal investigation. Louisiana law enforcement agencies responded, beginning the systematic work of evidence collection, witness interviews, and scene documentation that would be necessary to determine what happened and who bore criminal responsibility. The autopsy of the 2-year-old victim provided essential evidence about how she died. Forensic pathologists conducted a thorough examination, documenting all injuries and determining which were fatal. The medical evidence would establish whether the death resulted from natural causes, accident, negligence, or intentional harm. In the Cardwell case, the findings pointed toward homicide rather than accidental or natural death. What made the autopsy findings particularly significant was the evidence they provided about the nature and timing of the fatal injuries. Could the injuries described by Lanaya Cardwell as accidental actually have been caused in the manner she claimed? The medical evidence would answer this question, and in many child homicide cases, there is a clear disconnect between the injuries found during autopsy and the explanations offered by the defendant. Interviews with Lanaya Cardwell became a focal point of the investigation. Detectives questioned her about her care of the 2-year-old, the events surrounding the child's death, and her explanations for how the fatal injuries occurred. These interviews would be recorded and documented, creating a record that could be compared to physical evidence and to the statements of other witnesses. Inconsistencies in Cardwell's account would become investigative red flags requiring further exploration. The investigation also examined the context of the Cardwell family's situation. What stressors were present in Lanaya Cardwell's life? Were there financial problems, relationship issues, substance abuse concerns, or mental health challenges? While such factors never excuse the killing of a child, they can help investigators and prosecutors understand the circumstances surrounding the crime and may be relevant to charging decisions and sentencing. Child Protective Services' involvement with the family, if any existed, would be carefully reviewed. Had there been prior reports of concerns about the 2-year-old's welfare? Had caseworkers investigated the family? Were there services in place to support the family or to monitor the child's safety? If CPS had been involved, the question would arise whether the agency had adequately assessed the risk to the child and whether intervention measures had been sufficient. Family members, friends, neighbors, and others who knew the Cardwell family were interviewed as part of the investigation. Had they observed anything concerning about how Lanaya Cardwell interacted with her 2-year-old daughter? Were there incidents of harsh discipline, injuries that seemed inconsistent with the explanations given, or other warning signs? Witnesses who had seen problematic behavior would provide crucial corroboration for the prosecution's case. The prosecution of Lanaya Cardwell proceeded based on the evidence gathered during the investigation. The specific charges would reflect prosecutors' determination of Cardwell's mental state and the circumstances of the killing. In Louisiana, charges for killing one's own child can range from second-degree murder to first-degree murder, depending on factors like premeditation and intent. The prosecution would seek charges that accurately reflected the evidence, and that would result in appropriate punishment if conviction was secured. Pretrial proceedings addressed various legal questions that would shape how the trial unfolded. Could certain evidence be admitted? What expert witnesses would testify? Would the defense present an insanity or diminished capacity defense? These and many other questions were resolved through pretrial motions and hearings, with the judge making rulings that would govern the conduct of the trial. When the case went to trial, the courtroom became the setting for a careful presentation of evidence by both sides. The prosecution called medical experts to explain the autopsy findings and to testify about why the injuries were inconsistent with accidental causes. Law enforcement officers described the investigation and the evolution of Lanaya Cardwell's statements. Physical evidence from the scene was presented to corroborate the prosecution's theory of how the death occurred. The defense strategy likely focused on creating reasonable doubt about Cardwell's culpability or on presenting mitigating circumstances that might reduce her level of criminal responsibility. This could include expert testimony about mental health issues, challenges to the medical evidence, or presentation of evidence about Cardwell's character and history that might generate sympathy from the jury. However, the prosecution's evidence would need to be strong to result in charges being filed in the first place. Jurors in the Cardwell case had to evaluate emotionally difficult evidence about the death of a 2-year-old child. The photographs, medical testimony, and other evidence would be disturbing, but jurors were tasked with setting aside emotional reactions to focus on whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberations would require careful consideration of all the evidence presented. If Lanaya Cardwell was convicted, the sentencing phase would include victim impact statements from family members who loved the 2-year-old victim. These statements would describe the child's personality, the joy she brought to their lives, and the devastating impact of her loss. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and potentially the child's father would have the opportunity to speak about how the crime affected them and what they believed would be appropriate punishment. The judge who sentenced Lanaya Cardwell would consider multiple factors: the age and vulnerability of the victim, the betrayal of maternal duty, any evidence of premeditation or particularly cruel treatment, Cardwell's mental state, and any mitigating factors, and the need for both punishment and deterrence. The sentence would reflect Louisiana's commitment to protecting children and holding those who harm them accountable. The 2-year-old daughter of Lanaya Cardwell should have had a lifetime ahead of her, years of growth, learning, relationships, and achievement. Instead, her life was cut short in 2021 by her own mother. She joins the tragic list of Louisiana children who died at the hands of those meant to protect them, her memory serving as a reminder of the critical importance of child protection efforts. The community where this tragedy occurred responded with grief and anger, struggling to understand how a mother could kill her own toddler. Vigils may have been held, with community members gathering to remember the young victim and to express solidarity with those committed to preventing child abuse. Local organizations used the case to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse and the importance of reporting concerns to authorities. For those who investigated and prosecuted the Cardwell case, it represented another emotionally difficult but professionally important case. Seeking justice for a 2-year-old victim who could not speak for herself requires dedication and the ability to handle disturbing evidence while maintaining professional objectivity. The successful prosecution of such cases, while emotionally costly for those involved, serves the essential purpose of holding perpetrators accountable and providing some measure of justice for victims. The question of prevention continues to haunt cases like this. Could intervention at an earlier stage have saved the 2-year-old's life? Were there warning signs that were missed or not taken seriously enough? Child protection professionals constantly struggle with these questions, trying to identify high-risk situations before tragedy occurs while also respecting family privacy and avoiding unnecessary intrusion into families where children are safe. The Cardwell case adds to the body of knowledge about maternal filicide and child homicide more generally. Each case contributes to understanding risk factors, warning signs, and potential intervention points. While this knowledge cannot bring back the children who have already died, it may help protect future children by improving the ability of professionals and community members to identify and respond to situations where children are at risk. Lanaya Cardwell's 2-year-old daughter is remembered by those who loved her, family members who recall her laugh, her personality, the things that made her unique. She was not just a statistic or a case number. She was a real child whose life had value and whose death represented an irreplaceable loss. The justice system's response to her death, through investigation, prosecution, and sentencing, represents society's commitment to protecting children and valuing their lives. Case 10. Erika Wigstrom, 2014. The poisoning death of a 17-month-old son. Our final case takes us back to 2014, when Erika Wigstrom killed her 17-month-old son by poisoning him with hand sanitizer. This case is particularly disturbing because of the method of killing, slowly poisoning a toddler over time using a product that most people consider harmless. The premeditation and sustained nature of this crime make it one of the most chilling cases of maternal violence in Louisiana's recent history. A 17-month-old child is a toddler in the full bloom of early development. Children this age are typically walking, beginning to run, saying multiple words, and perhaps combining them into simple phrases. They're exploring their environment with curiosity and energy, getting into everything as they learn about their world. A 17-month-old is completely dependent on caregivers, but is interactive enough to clearly express preferences and emotions. This is an age of rapid development and endless potential. The method of killing in this case, poisoning with hand sanitizer, demonstrates a level of premeditation and deliberation that distinguishes it from cases of sudden violence or loss of control. Hand sanitizer contains high concentrations of alcohol, typically 60 to 95%. When consumed by a small child, the alcohol can cause acute poisoning, affecting the central nervous system and potentially causing death. The fact that Erika Wigstrom used this method to kill her son suggests that she researched or understood how to use this common household product as a poison. The investigation into the death of Erika Wigstrom's 17-month-old son began when the toddler was brought to a hospital with symptoms consistent with alcohol poisoning. Medical staff treating the child became suspicious when the symptoms did not match any innocent explanation. Toxicology testing revealed dangerously high levels of alcohol in the toddler's system, levels that could only have resulted from the deliberate administration of alcohol-containing products like hand sanitizer. Once medical professionals determined that the child had been poisoned, law enforcement was notified and a criminal investigation began. The focus immediately turned to who had the opportunity to poison the toddler and who might have had a motive to harm him. As the investigation progressed, evidence pointed toward Erika Wigstrom as the perpetrator. The sustained nature of the poisoning suggested that this was not a one-time incident, but rather a pattern of deliberately harming the child. The autopsy and toxicology reports were crucial to establishing the cause of death. Forensic pathologists determined that the 17-month-old died from alcohol poisoning consistent with the ingestion of hand sanitizer. The medical evidence established that the levels of alcohol in the child's system were far beyond what could result from accidental exposure, and that the child had likely been given alcohol-containing products on multiple occasions before the fatal poisoning. Interviews with Erika Wigstrom revealed inconsistencies and contradictions in her explanations for her son's condition. Initially, she may have denied any knowledge of how the child could have been exposed to alcohol. As evidence mounted, however, investigators confronted her with the medical findings and the impossibility of her explanations. The interview process, documented in police reports, showed the progression from denial to eventual admission as the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. The investigation also examined whether there had been prior concerns about the 17-month-old's welfare. Had he been brought to doctors or emergency rooms with symptoms that, in retrospect, might have indicated previous poisoning attempts? Were there medical records showing a pattern of unexplained illnesses or symptoms? This historical medical information would help establish whether the fatal poisoning was an isolated incident or the culmination of a pattern of abuse. Child Protective Services records were reviewed to determine whether there had been any prior involvement with the Wigstrom family. If reports had been made about the child's welfare, if caseworkers had investigated, or if services had been provided, this information would be relevant to understanding the context of the death and whether opportunities to prevent it had existed. The answers to these questions would be significant not just for the criminal case, but also for policy discussions about child protection. The prosecution of Erika Wigstrom for the murder of her 17-month-old son proceeded based on the strong evidence of deliberate poisoning. The charges reflected the premeditated nature of the crime. This was not a case of momentary loss of control, but rather a sustained course of conduct aimed at harming and ultimately killing the child. Louisiana law provides for severe punishment in cases of premeditated child murder, and the prosecution would seek the maximum appropriate penalty. Expert testimony would be crucial in the Wigstrom trial. Medical experts would explain how alcohol poisoning works, what levels of alcohol consumption are fatal in small children, and why the levels found in the victim's system could only have resulted from deliberate administration. Toxicologists would testify about the presence of alcohol in the child's system and rule out alternative explanations. These expert witnesses would provide the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case. The defense in such a case faces enormous challenges. How does one defend a mother accused of slowly poisoning her own toddler with hand sanitizer? Defense strategies might include mental health arguments, suggesting that Wigstrom suffered from severe psychological disturbance that impaired her judgment. However, the sustained and methodical nature of the poisoning makes it difficult to argue that the defendant was not aware of what she was doing or that she lacked the capacity to form criminal intent. Jurors in the Wigstrom case would hear evidence that was both scientifically complex and emotionally disturbing. They would need to understand the medical testimony about alcohol poisoning while also grappling with the horror of a mother deliberately poisoning her own toddler. The jury's task was to determine whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Erika Wigstrom deliberately killed her 17-month-old son through poisoning. The guilty verdict, when it came, brought justice for the 17-month-old victim but could not undo the suffering he endured. The toddler's final days or weeks, as he was slowly poisoned by his own mother, must have been filled with confusion and physical distress. A 17-month-old cannot understand why they feel sick or why the person who should comfort them is actually the source of their suffering. The betrayal of maternal duty in this case was complete and devastating. The sentencing phase included victim impact statements from family members who loved the 17-month-old boy, grandparents, the child's father if he was not complicit in the crime, and other relatives spoke about the joy the toddler brought to their lives and the devastating impact of his loss. They described a happy, developing child whose life was stolen by his own mother in a particularly cruel and calculated manner. The judge who sentenced Erika Wigstrom considered the especially heinous nature of the crime. Slowly poisoning a toddler over time demonstrates a level of depravity and callousness that warrants the most serious punishment available under Louisiana law. The sentence reflected the premeditated nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, the complete betrayal of maternal duty, and the need for both punishment and deterrence. The method of killing in this case, poisoning with hand sanitizer, raised awareness about the potential dangers of common household products. While hand sanitizer is safe when used as intended, in the hands of someone intent on harm, it can be weaponized. The Wigstrom case prompted discussions about the accessibility of alcohol-containing products in households with young children and the need for vigilance by family members and medical professionals in identifying unexplained symptoms that might indicate poisoning. Medical professionals who treated the 17-month-old, both before his final hospitalization if there were prior incidents, and during his final illness, likely experienced significant emotional impact from the case. Pediatricians, emergency room staff, and intensive care personnel who worked to save the child's life had to cope with the knowledge that his own mother was responsible for his death. These professionals carry the weight of such cases while continuing to provide care to other children. For law enforcement and prosecutors who worked the Wigstrom case, it represented one of the most disturbing cases of their careers. The sustained nature of the poisoning, the vulnerability of the 17-month-old victim, and the betrayal of maternal trust made this case particularly difficult emotionally, even as it was professionally compelling due to the strength of the evidence. The successful prosecution provided some measure of justice for the victim and protected society from a dangerous individual. The 17-month-old son of Erika Wigstrom should have had a lifetime ahead of him. He should have grown from a toddler into a child, then an adolescent, then an adult with his own dreams and achievements. Instead, his life was deliberately ended in 2014 by his own mother using hand sanitizer as a poison. His death, like those of the other children examined in this documentary, represents an unthinkable betrayal of the maternal bond and a profound violation of the child's right to safety and protection. The community where the Wigstrom family lived struggled to comprehend how a mother could slowly poison her own toddler. The sustained nature of the poisoning made it particularly difficult to understand. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a single act of violence, but rather a deliberate course of conduct aimed at killing the child. Community members gathered to remember the 17-month-old victim and to express their commitment to protecting other children from similar fates. The Wigstrom case serves as a reminder that child abuse can take many forms, some more obvious than others. Physical abuse leaves visible injuries that teachers, doctors, or others might notice. Poisoning, however, can be harder to detect, with symptoms that might initially be attributed to illness rather than deliberate harm. The medical professionals who ultimately identified the alcohol poisoning in this case prevented what might have been attributed to natural causes if less vigilant care had been provided. Child protection advocates have used the Wigstrom case to emphasize the importance of medical professionals maintaining a high index of suspicion for abuse when children present with unexplained symptoms or illnesses. Unexplained illness in a young child should always prompt consideration of whether someone might be deliberately causing the symptoms, a pattern known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or, more recently, factitious disorder imposed on another. While most parents are loving caregivers seeking help for genuinely sick children, the Wigstrom case demonstrates that some parents deliberately harm their children. The legacy of the Wigstrom case extends beyond the criminal conviction. Medical journals and professional conferences examining child abuse have used this case as an example of poisoning as a form of child abuse. Training materials for pediatricians, emergency room physicians, and child protection workers now include information about recognizing the signs of deliberate poisoning and the importance of toxicology testing when symptoms don't match innocent explanations. Erika Wigstrom will spend many years, possibly the rest of her life, in Louisiana's prison system as a result of her conviction. The other inmates and correctional staff know what she did. Child killers are among the most reviled individuals in prison populations. Her life has been forever defined by the deliberate poisoning of her 17-month-old son, an act that branded her as one of Louisiana's most evil mothers. The 17-month-old boy who died in 2014 is remembered by family members who loved him. Photographs preserve his image, a smiling toddler who should have had decades of life ahead of him. Memorial services and anniversaries of his death provide opportunities for family members to gather, remember, and honor his brief life. The justice system ensured that his death was not dismissed or ignored, but was thoroughly investigated and prosecuted. As we conclude this examination of 10 cases of maternal violence in Louisiana, the Erika Wigstrom case serves as a particularly chilling final example. The sustained nature of the poisoning, the calculated use of hand sanitizer as a weapon, and the vulnerability of the 17-month-old victim combined to create one of the most disturbing cases in this documentary. It reminds us that evil can manifest in unexpected ways, and that the people children should trust most can sometimes be their greatest danger. Conclusion: understanding the unthinkable. We have examined 10 cases of maternal violence in Louisiana, spanning from 2007 to 2024. These cases represent some of the most evil acts committed by mothers in the Pelican State during this period. Each case involved the death of a child at the hands of a mother or someone acting in a maternal role, and each case left behind grieving families, traumatized communities, and haunting questions about how such tragedies can be prevented. The victims in these cases range from 5 months old to 6 years old. Each child was at a different stage of development, but all shared the common characteristic of complete dependence on adults for care and protection. These children trusted their mothers or mother figures to keep them safe, to meet their needs, and to guide them through the vulnerable years of childhood. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible, resulting in death. The methods of killing varied across these cases. Some children died from physical trauma, beaten or otherwise physically harmed by their mothers. One infant was burned in an act of unspeakable cruelty. One toddler was slowly poisoned with hand sanitizer over time. One baby died after being left in a hot car. The variety of methods demonstrates that maternal violence takes many forms, each horrific in its own way. The motivations behind these crimes, where they could be determined, also varied. Some cases may have involved severe mental illness, including postpartum depression or psychosis. Others may have resulted from anger, stress, or the challenges of parenting overwhelming a mother's ability to cope. Some cases showed evidence of sustained abuse over time, while others appeared to involve single incidents of fatal violence. In some cases, the motivation remains unclear, known only to the perpetrator. What these cases share is the devastating betrayal of the maternal bond. Society expects mothers to be their children's fiercest protectors, to sacrifice their own comfort and safety for their offspring, to nurture and care for children even when parenting is difficult or stressful. When a mother violates this expectation by harming her own child, it shakes our fundamental assumptions about family, safety, and human nature. The legal system's response to these cases has been consistent: thorough investigation, serious criminal charges, and, in cases resulting in conviction, significant prison sentences. Louisiana's justice system has demonstrated a commitment to protecting children and holding those who harm them accountable. The investigations were professional and comprehensive, the prosecutions were vigorous, and the sentences reflected the severity of the crimes. However, punishment after the fact, while necessary for justice and deterrence, cannot undo the harm done to child victims. The real challenge is prevention, identifying families at risk, and intervening before abuse escalates to tragedy. This is extraordinarily difficult work, requiring coordination among many different systems and professionals. Child Protective Services plays a crucial role in this prevention effort, but CPS workers face enormous challenges. They must balance the need to protect children against the importance of family preservation and parental rights. They must make risk assessments based on incomplete information and predict future behavior based on past patterns. They work with crushing caseloads and limited resources. Despite these challenges, CPS workers across Louisiana continue their efforts to protect vulnerable children. Healthcare providers are also on the front lines of child protection. Pediatricians, emergency room doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals are trained to recognize signs of abuse and to report suspicions to authorities. In some cases in this documentary, medical professionals played crucial roles in identifying that children had been harmed and in gathering evidence that led to criminal prosecution. Their vigilance saves lives and brings perpetrators to justice. Teachers and school personnel similarly serve as important protectors of children. Elementary school teachers see children every day and may notice changes in behavior, unexplained injuries, or other signs of problems at home. School counselors, nurses, and administrators all play roles in identifying at-risk children and ensuring that appropriate reports are made to child protection authorities. Law enforcement officers who investigate crimes against children deserve recognition for the difficult and emotionally draining work they do. Processing crime scenes involving child victims, interviewing suspects who have harmed their own children, and gathering evidence in cases of child abuse requires both professional skill and emotional resilience. The detectives and officers who worked the cases examined in this documentary ensured that victims received justice. Prosecutors who handle child abuse and homicide cases similarly carry heavy burdens. They must present evidence that is often disturbing and graphic, cross-examine defendants and witnesses about horrific acts, and make strategic decisions that can determine whether justice is achieved. The emotional toll of this work is significant, but prosecutors continue because they understand the importance of holding child abusers accountable and protecting vulnerable victims. Mental health professionals have important roles both in prevention and in understanding these crimes. Therapists and counselors who work with struggling parents may help prevent abuse before it occurs. Forensic psychologists who evaluate defendants help courts understand the mental states of those accused of harming children. Researchers who study child abuse, maternal filicide, and related topics contribute to the knowledge base that informs policy and practice. Community members, neighbors, friends, extended family members also have responsibilities in protecting children. When someone sees or suspects child abuse, they have both a moral and often legal obligation to report it. While making such reports can be uncomfortable and can strain relationships, the alternative, remaining silent while a child is harmed, is unconscionable. These cases demonstrate that silence can be deadly. The question of whether these tragedies could have been prevented haunts everyone involved in child protection work. In some cases, there were clear warning signs that were either missed or not taken seriously enough. In other cases, the abuse was so well hidden that even careful observers had no indication of the danger the child faced. The challenge is to improve our collective ability to identify at-risk children while acknowledging that not every tragedy can be prevented. Policymakers at state and local levels have responsibilities to ensure that child protection systems are adequately funded and staffed, that mandated reporters receive appropriate training, and that laws protecting children are comprehensive and enforceable. Louisiana, like all states, continually works to improve its child welfare system, learning from tragedies and implementing changes designed to better protect vulnerable children. The children who died in these 10 cases are gone, but they are not forgotten. Each is remembered by family members who love them, by communities that mourn their loss, and by the professionals who work to achieve justice on their behalf. Their deaths have contributed to increased awareness of child abuse, improved training for professionals, and strengthened commitment to protecting Louisiana's children. As we close this examination of Louisiana's most evil mothers, we must acknowledge the difficulty of this topic. These are not easy stories to tell or to hear. They challenge our assumptions about motherhood, family, and safety. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence within families and the vulnerability of children. But these stories must be told because the victims deserve to be remembered and because awareness is essential to prevention. If you or someone you know is struggling with parenting challenges, mental health issues, or the risk of harming a child, help is available. The National Child Abuse Hotline can be reached at 1-800-4-CHILD, 1-800-424-2453. Mental health crisis lines, parenting support programs, and community resources exist to help families before crisis occurs. Reaching out for help is a sign of strength, not weakness, and may prevent tragedy. If you suspect that a child is being abused or neglected, please report your concerns to your state's Child Protective Services agency or to law enforcement. You do not need proof. Suspicion based on reasonable observations is sufficient to warrant a report. In Louisiana, as in all states, certain professionals are mandated reporters who are legally required to report suspicions of abuse, but anyone can and should report concerns about child welfare. Thank you for watching this Cold Case Hour documentary on the most evil mothers in Louisiana. We understand that this content was difficult and disturbing. Our goal has been to honor the memories of the child victims by telling their stories with the seriousness and respect they deserve, to inform viewers about these cases, and to contribute to the ongoing conversation about how to better protect children from violence within their own families. If you found this documentary informative, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more in-depth true crime coverage. Your engagement helps us continue producing these important documentaries that shine light on difficult topics and remember victims who deserve to be remembered. The 10 cases we examined today represent only a fraction of the child abuse and neglect that occurs in Louisiana and across the nation. For every case that results in a child's death and a criminal prosecution, there are countless other cases of abuse that don't end fatally, but that still cause significant harm to children. The work of protecting children is ongoing, and it requires the commitment of everyone in our communities. These mothers, Amy Hebert, Twyena Thomas, Felicia Marie Nicole Smith, Shalyn Ewing, Aaliyah Jack, Hannah Faith Cormier, Bunnak Hannah, Landon, Jasmine Anderson, Lanaya Cardwell, and Erika Wigstrom, committed unthinkable acts against children who depended on them. Their names will forever be associated with some of Louisiana's most horrific crimes. But more importantly, we remember the names and honor the memories of their victims, the innocent children whose lives were stolen. As we conclude, let us commit ourselves to vigilance in protecting children, to reporting suspicions of abuse, to supporting families struggling with parenting challenges, and to ensuring that Louisiana's children can grow up safe, loved, and protected. These 10 tragic cases demonstrate what can happen when children are not adequately protected. Let their memories inspire us to do better, to be more vigilant, and to ensure that future Louisiana children are kept safe from harm. May the children who died in these cases rest in peace. May their families find some measure of comfort in knowing that justice was pursued on their behalf. And may we all learn from these tragedies and work together to protect the vulnerable children in our communities. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and never hesitate to speak up when a child's safety is at stake.